Chapter 1. The Waiting Ranch. The wind carried dust across the main street of Red Rock, rolling it into ghostly swirls between the saloon and the livery. Eli Carter stood at the hitching post, one hand resting on the worn reins of his bay gelding, the other tugging at the brim of his hat. His boots were caked in prairie dirt, his shirt sun-faded, and the shadows under his eyes told of night spent more in silence than in sleep. For years, his ranch had been his only world, an endless stretch of sagebrush and creaking fences, where a man's voice sounded strange if he spoke aloud too often. Now he was waiting. The noon stagecoach rattled in with a sound of iron wheels and whip cracks. Folks spilled from the saloon, swinging doors to watch. Townsfolk always did when the wagon rolled in. They liked to measure new faces, and word had slipped from the telegraph office that Eli Carter had sent for a bride. A loner inviting a stranger into his home was worth a dozen whispered wagers over whiskey. Eli's jaw clenched as the stage ground to a stop. He'd pictured someone small, gentle, the kind of woman whose voice might soften the silence of his ranch. His heart thudded hard against his ribs when the door swung open. Boots hit the dirt first, then a long skirt, and then her. The woman who stepped down was taller than most men in town, her shoulders broad, her waist sturdy, her chest rising and falling as if she were unbothered by the stairs. The sun caught strands of her copper-brown hair, pinned hastily under her bonnet. Her face was strong-jawed, her eyes sharp and unflinching as she swept her gaze across the crowd. When the whispers rose, she answered with nothing but a lift of her chin. "Clara Boone?" Eli's voice came out rougher than he meant, the desert wind scraping his throat. She turned to him, and for a heartbeat his chest hollowed with uncertainty. Then her lips curved into a faint, almost daring smile. "Mr. Carter, I presume. You look like a man who doesn't waste words." Eli shifted his weight, spurs clinking. "Don't see the use in them, most days." From the boardwalk, a ranch hand muttered loud enough for all to hear, "Lord, that's a woman and a half." Laughter rippled through the onlookers. Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she strode toward Eli, skirts brushing the dust, until she stood close enough for him to catch the faint scent of soap and train smoke. "I came a long way," she said evenly. "If you've changed your mind, best tell me now." The world seemed to still. The creak of the saloon sign, the stamp of hooves, even the desert wind paused. Eli swallowed hard. She was not the woman he had imagined, but something in her steady gaze struck deeper than he wanted to admit. "I ain't changed my mind," he said at last, his voice low, almost a vow. "Let's get you home." Together they walked toward his horse, the crowd parting around them. Behind them, whispers rose again, but Eli kept his eyes on the road ahead. Dust rose around their boots as they left town, two strangers bound by promise, and the endless prairie waiting to test them both. Chapter 2. A Woman Out of Place. The ranch house came into view as the sun slid lower, painting the prairie in gold and copper. Clara Boone sat tall in the saddle, riding Eli's second horse as though she'd been born to it. Her skirts were dust-streaked from the trail, but she didn't fidget or complain. Eli, riding a pace ahead, kept his eyes forward, though every few moments he stole a glance at her, at the way her broad hands held the rein steady, at the unshaken calm in her face. When they dismounted in the yard, silence pressed between them heavier than the desert heat. The ranch house stood plain and weathered, a lean building with shutters that rattled when the wind cut across the plain. Clara looked at it, then at him. "It's honest," she said. "I've seen worse." Eli's lips twitched, almost a smile, but he turned quickly, busying himself with the saddles. He didn't know how to answer a woman so direct. Inside, the house smelled of dry wood and old coffee. Clara set her trunk down by the wall, straightening to take in the single-room space. Bed shoved against one corner, table and two chairs near the hearth, tools hanging neat on the wall. It was a man's home, bare, silent, lonely. "You live quiet," she said softly, brushing a hand over the table's rough grain. "Only way I know," Eli replied, hanging his hat on the peg. She turned to face him, her eyes glinting. "And you sent for a wife, thinking she'd fit into that quiet?" His shoulders stiffened. He'd expected gratitude, perhaps ought the miles of land he worked alone. Instead, her words struck like flint. "I figured maybe a woman wouldn't mind it. Maybe she'd be glad for space." Clara laughed, low and not unkind, though there was steel in it. "I didn't come all this way to be space filler, Mr. Carter. I came to be a partner. A wife. You can't shut me out like you shut the world out." Her boldness made him take a step back, bumping against the table. In town, she had faced whispers and mockery without blinking. Here, in his own house, she faced him the same way. Before he could find words, the sound of distant coyotes rose through the dusk. Clara went to the window, staring out at the darkening prairie. Her reflection in the glass looked unbreakable. But when she spoke, her voice softened. "I know what folks see when they look at me. Too big, too much, not what a man dreams about. But I won't apologize for what I am. If you want a wife who will sit quiet and shrink, you sent for the wrong woman." Eli's throat tightened. He'd never heard anyone speak with such fire. His gaze fell to her hands, strong enough to mend fences, gentle enough, maybe, to mend something in him too. "I ain't asking you to shrink," he muttered finally. "Just give me time to learn how to share my silence." Clara turned then, meeting his eyes with a small, fierce smile. "Time's fair, but I'm not going to stand in a corner waiting. You'll see me, Eli Carter, one way or another." The firelight flickered against the walls as night settled, throwing long shadows across the room. Two strangers, bound by vow, now stood in the uncertain space between loneliness and something that might yet grow into love. Chapter 3. Storm on the Prairie. The sky turned iron gray by afternoon, wind snapping across the prairie grass like a warning. Eli and Clara worked shoulder to shoulder, mending a sagging stretch of fence before the storm broke. Clara's skirts were pinned up out of the way, her sleeves rolled, hammer swinging with a rhythm that matched Eli's. Sweat streaked the dust on her face, but her eyes burned with focus. "You swing like you've done this before," Eli said, voice gruff over the whine of the wind. "My pa's farm didn't run on gentleness," she answered, driving a nail home with a solid crack. "I know my way around wood and wire. You'll find I'm no porcelain doll." A low rumble rolled across the horizon. Eli glanced at her again, broad-shouldered, steady, unshaken by work or weather. Something twisted in his chest, a mix of admiration and unease. She was more than he'd bargained for, more than he believed he wanted. The first drops fell as they led the horses back toward the barn, fat and cold. By the time they reached the yard, rain slashed sideways, rattling the tin roof like rifle fire. Inside, the animals stamped and snorted against the storm's fury. Clara moved quick, calming them with a sure hand, murmuring low as if her voice alone could anchor them. Eli watched her, shadows shifting over his face. She belongs here. The thought came unbidden, unsettling. The storm finally spent itself near sundown, leaving the air sharp with wet sage and thunder still grumbling far off. Eli saddled up to ride into town for supplies. Clara hesitated at the barn door, wiping mud from her arms. "Be careful in there," she said. "Men look for weakness where they think they'll find it." He didn't answer, just gave a short nod. The saloon was warm with lamplight and the smell of whiskey when he pushed through the swinging doors. Conversation lulled, then picked up again in low tones. He could feel their eyes on him, the loner rancher who had brought home a woman larger than life. From the corner table, a ranch hand with too much whiskey in him spat out, "Carter!" Heard your bride's got bigger fists than you. Maybe she's the one wrangling cattle while you sit and sew." Laughter followed, sharp and ugly. Eli's jaw locked. He'd lived years ignoring talk, but this was different. He stepped forward, spurs clinking on the creaking boards. "Say it again," Eli growled. The drunk rose, grinning, and swung a sloppy punch. Eli ducked, then drove his fist into the man's gut, sending him crashing into the card table. Chairs toppled, men cursed, whiskey spilled. For a moment, the saloon was nothing but fists, boots, and curses until the sheriff's bark broke it apart. Later, bruised and bleeding from a split lip, Eli rode home in silence. Clara was waiting at the porch, lantern in hand. She saw the blood, her eyes flashing with anger, not at him, but at what the town had dared. Without a word, she led him inside, dabbing his cut with steady fingers. "You didn't have to fight for me," she said softly, though her hand lingered on his cheek longer than it needed to. "Didn't have a choice," Eli muttered. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, he let the truth slip past his defenses. "You're mine now. They'll know it." The lantern light flickered between them. Storm spent, but another just beginning. This one burning slow and dangerous in the space where silence used to live. Chapter 4, Shadows of the Past. The prairie was quiet after the storm, but Eli felt the old unease creeping in, the kind that never fully left a man who had lived by the gun. He had buried that past under dust and silence, yet word traveled fast out here. And when trouble came, it came riding hard. It was Clara who saw them first. She'd gone into Red Rock to buy flour and lamp oil, standing firm in the general store while the townsfolk whispered as always. When she stepped outside, 3 men leaned against a rail by the saloon, spurs glinting, guns slung low. They weren't cowhands. They had the swagger of wolves. One of them tipped his hat with a grin that held no warmth. "Well, if it ain't Carter's big bride. Heard about you, miss. Didn't think you were real." Clara's spine straightened. She adjusted the basket in her arms and met his stare without flinching. "And yet here I stand. Best step aside." The men chuckled. Another spat tobacco into the dust. "Carter used to ride with us. Man could draw faster than sin itself. Shame he tucked tail and turned farmer. But we're here to remind him, men like us don't just walk away." His gaze raked her up and down. "He's hiding behind you now." Her blood ran hot, but her voice came cold as steel. "Eli Carter doesn't hide behind anyone, least of all me." She shifted her weight, ready if one of them dared closer, but they only laughed, sauntering off toward the watering trough as if toying with her resolve. When Eli met her back at the ranch, she set the basket down harder than she meant. "They're here," she said. "Men who knew you before. They want this land." Eli's face hardened, shadows deepening around his eyes. "I told you. I've done things I can't scrub clean. Rode with outlaws for money. Left men bleeding in the dust. I walked away when I saw what it was turning me into. But they don't forgive. They'll try to use you to get to me." Clara stepped closer, her hand pressing against his chest, feeling the thump of his heart. "And you think sending me away will keep me safe? I didn't cross half a continent to run at the first sign of danger." Eli swallowed, torn between the fear of losing her and the deeper fear of letting her see the man he had been. "You don't understand. If they come, I'll have to be that man again. And once I start, I don't know if I can stop." The prairie wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the faint howl of a coyote. Clara's eyes never wavered. "You've hidden long enough, Eli. I don't care about the man you were. I care about the man who fought for me in that saloon, the man who works beside me in the dirt. If you'll stand, I'll stand beside you." For a moment, the silence between them felt heavier than 1,000 storms. Then Eli took her hand in his, rough fingers curling tight. If they want to fight, he said low, they'll find one here. And as the last of the daylight bled into red across the horizon, both knew the battle wasn't just for the ranch. It was for the fragile chance of love they carved out in the dust. Chapter 5, Gunfire and Promises. The night settled heavy over the Carter ranch, moonlight spilling silver across the prairie grass. The air was too still, too watchful. Eli sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, listening to cicadas. Clara moved quietly inside, trimming the lantern low, but she paused often at the window, her eyes sharp, unafraid. When the first shot cracked, it split the night wide open. The barn door shuddered under a spray of bullets. Horses screamed inside. Eli dropped to a crouch, returning fire into the dark. Shadows moved against the horizon. 3, maybe 4 men, his past riding back in flesh and iron. Clara burst onto the porch with another rifle. "Here," she called, tossing it to him before dropping to one knee, loading her own with steady hands. Her skirts whipped in the night wind, but her grip was sure, her eyes blazing. "Clara," Eli started, breath rough. "Don't you dare tell me to hide," she snapped. "I'm not some porcelain bride. I fight for what's mine." He didn't argue. The whistle of lead filled the yard, chips of wood flying from the porch rail. Eli fired, and one shadow went down with a shout. The others kept coming, spurs clinking, guns flashing. Clara leaned into the rail, rifle pressed to her shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang true, knocking a lantern from one man's hand. Flames licked across the dry grass, lighting the battlefield in a hellish glow. Bullets hissed past Eli's ear. He threw himself low, rolled into the yard, and fired again. Another outlaw staggered back, clutching his arm. The remaining 2 pressed harder, emboldened. Then Clara's rifle jammed. "Damn," she muttered, slamming against the rail. One outlaw spotted her hesitation and charged, pistol raised. Eli's heart slammed into his ribs. Too far, too fast. He ran, firing, but the shot went wide. The outlaw raised his weapon at Clara, and she swung the butt of the jammed rifle with all her strength, catching him across the jaw. He went sprawling into the dust, out cold, breathless. Eli pulled her close, shielding her as another bullet whined past. "You near gave me a heart attack, woman," he growled. "You're welcome," she shot back, her voice trembling only slightly. The last outlaw hesitated at the edge of the firelight, then cursed and bolted into the dark. Sirens of hoofbeats soon followed. The sheriff and his deputies, late but not too late. When the smoke cleared, Eli sagged against the porch post, blood dripping from a shallow graze on his arm. Clara tore fabric from her skirt to bind it, her hand surprisingly gentle after the fury of battle. "You could have been killed," she whispered, her face inches from his. His eyes found hers, raw and unguarded. "I thought I'd lost you, Clara, and I realized I'd rather die than let you go. You're more than I ever dreamed. You're mine." Her hand stilled, her breath catching. Then she leaned in, pressing her forehead against his, her voice low as the dawn breaking. "And you're mine, Eli Carter. I'll fight every storm, every bullet, every whisper, so long as you're beside me." The fire in the yard dimmed, leaving only the glow of lantern light. Together they stood on the porch, bruised but unbroken, bound not just by survival, but by the promise of something fiercer than either had known before. Chapter 6, The Bride and the Rancher. The prairie dawn rose gentle after the violence, painting the sky with strokes of rose and gold. Smoke still curled from the blackened patch of grass near the barn, but the air held a strange quiet, like the land itself was breathing again. Eli Carter leaned on the porch rail, his arm bound in Clara's careful bandage. He had faced gunfire before, but never with fear gnawing at him like last night. The fear of losing her. Inside, Clara moved about with sure steps, stoking the stove, sweeping up broken glass from a shattered window. She hummed softly, a sound so alive it filled a ranch house more than any storm ever could. When she caught Eli watching, she smirked. "Don't look at me like that, Mr. Carter. You married a fighter, not a ghost." Eli's throat worked, words heavy on his tongue. "I thought I wanted silence out here, just a land in my own shadow." He stepped closer, his voice low and rough. "But the truth is, Clara, I was waiting for you. Didn't know it till last night. For a heartbeat." Her strong face softened, the steel in her eyes tempered with warmth. She reached up, brushing her fingers against his cheek, where a bruise still bloomed. "Then stop waiting, Eli. We're here now. Together." By noon, townsfolk rode out to the ranch, curiosity pulling them as strong as gossip ever had. They expected to see ruin, maybe tragedy. Instead, they found Eli and Clara standing side by side in the yard, rifles still propped against the porch. Word spread quick that the giant bride had fought like a legend, dropping outlaws with steadier aim than most men dared. Whispers shifted from mockery to respect. At the general store the next week, women glanced at Clara differently. Some with envy, others with admiration. A little girl tugged at her mother's skirt, whispering, "She's the bravest lady I ever saw." Clara only smiled, but when Eli caught her eye across the room, pride flared hot in his chest. One evening, with the sun sinking in a blaze of orange over the prairie, Eli saddled 2 horses. Clara stepped out in her riding skirt, hair pinned back, rifle strapped to her saddle just in case. He offered his hand, and when she took it, he didn't let go. "Clara Boone, Carter," he said, voice steady as the horizon. "Folks can say what they will, but you're the only woman I'll ever need. My partner, my heart." Her smile curved slow and certain, stronger than any vow. "And you're mine, Eli. Loner no more." They rode out side by side, the dust rising behind them, coyotes howling in the distance. The ranch lay small against the endless land, but together they looked out at it and beyond, husband and wife, forged in fire and storm, bound for a future as wide and untamed as the West itself. The sun dropped low, framing them in gold, and for the first time in years, Eli Carter felt the world wasn't empty. It was full, because Clara rode beside him. The sun bled its last light across the plains, painting the sky in streaks of fire and rose. Eli and Clara rode slow along the ridge, the sound of their horses' hoofs muffled against the dry earth. Below them, the ranch stretched wide and quiet, fences mended, smoke curling from a chimney. A place once silent as a tomb, now alive with the echo of laughter and the promise of tomorrow. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush, mingled with distant strains of saloon music, drifting up from Red Rock. Coyotes yipped far off, but their cries felt like part of the land, not a threat. For the first time in years, Eli felt peace instead of emptiness. Clara reined her horse closer, her silhouette strong against the dying light. "You reckon they'll ever stop talking about us?" she asked with a half-smile. "Let 'em talk," Eli said, his voice low, steady. He reached for her hand across the space between saddles, rough fingers closing over hers. "All I care is what you see when you look at me." Her eyes softened, catching the last flare of sunset. "I see home, Eli. I see forever." They sat there, 2 figures carved against the horizon, bound not by whispers or fear, but by fire, sweat, and a love too stubborn to break. As the sun dipped and the prairie swallowed the day, Eli leaned close, his words of vow carried on the wind. "From this day on, Clara Boone Carter, I ain't alone no more." And together, hand in hand, they rode into the deepening dusk. Husband and wife, stronger than the storm, a legend whispered on the wind of the Wild West.